Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. Today I'm going to be rebutting an essay in the New Yorker called Is Abortion Sacred by Gia Tolentino. And so it has a lot of the standard arguments I've been hearing lately. One of them is, among pro-choice individuals, I find surprising, are claims that abortion is not actually against biblical teaching, like the Bible supports being pro-choice. The Catholic Church hasn't always been against abortion, as if, and maybe it's because they think that abortion is just a religious issue. It's true that many religious people, many Christians are pro-life. It's probably true the majority of people who are pro-life are Christian. Although the majority of people in this country still identify as believing in God, I think a majority of them still say that they're Christian. But most of the people who made up the racial opposition to racial segregation were Christian. Think about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and he led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Just because you're religious doesn't mean you can't have a view on a human rights issue. So instead of just engaging the basic human rights arguments, they try to muddy the water by saying, oh, well, the church isn't really against this, and there's all these other factors we have to consider. So let's dive into it and see what this says and how we can take it apart. So going down here, I'm not going to read everything in the article, by the way, but I'll go through it a bit. She begins talking about how when she was in Bible class, I think she was like 13, you had to go across the room, agree or disagree to a proposition. And our teacher said proposition was abortion is always wrong. And we all walked to the side of the room that said agree. Then I raised my hand and I said, I think it is always morally wrong and absolutely murder, but if a woman is raped, I respect her right to get an abortion. Also, I said if a woman knew the child would face a terrible life, the child might be better off. Dead? The teacher asked. Yeah, good question. Better off what? Being, if someone's going to have a bad life, should we kill him or her? My classmates said I needed to go to the other side, and I did. Well, not just my classmates, that's how the game works. You either agree abortion is always wrong, or it's not always wrong. Imagine if we put something else in here besides abortion, like rape or lynching. Well, what about in these very certain circumstances? My classmates said, and you go to the side, no, that's the position that you took. I felt guilty and guilty and guilty, I wrote in my journal. I didn't feel like a Christian when I was on that side of the room. I felt terrible, actually. Now, what's interesting here is people talk about guilt, right? Now, this was at an evangelical church, but Catholics, talk about Catholic guilt, right? And so guilt can serve a useful function when it reminds us of that we are in contradiction to God's law, to God's will in our lives, and so we need to turn things around. And hopefully we accept that and we don't use it to actually distort what is right or wrong. So when we feel guilty, one temptation, the natural thing is to change our behavior and mindset to be in accord with what God wants. What the world would like us to do is to change what God wants, which we can't. We only pretend to do that in order to satisfy our guilty conscience. And so she goes on. Now, it's interesting here, she talked about, the issue of rape. And I understand how that's a difficult situation. Well, what about in the case of rape? But that's why you still have to get back to the question, while graciously addressing the injustice of rape, to ask, what is abortion? Why do you think abortion would be okay in the case of rape, but not in another very difficult circumstance where a person chose to have sex? It's a child in either situation. So she goes on, let's see here. I had always thought of abortion as it had been taught to me in school. It was a sin that irresponsible women committed to cover up another sin, having sex in a non-Christian manner. The moral universe was a stark battle of virtue and depravity, in which the only meaningful question about any possible action was whether or not it would be sanctioned in the eyes of God. That's a fair question to ask, right? Is this good or evil? And if God is pure goodness itself, shouldn't we ask him? Notice, this idea that, abortion is tied up in sexual sin. Now, in one sense, it is. I believe that if abortions occurred outside of the context of sexuality, like if you just pushed a button and it took your DNA and a baby was growing in an artificial womb, and some people said, well, I would like to dismember that baby. I don't want him or her anymore. There would be much, much more outrage. But because it's connected to sex, people go haywire in their thinking. Just like people will reject the idea of being transracial, like that a white person can be black just because they say so. People see the reality there because sex isn't involved. But they accept transgender ideology because if something is related to sex, our brains just aren't really great at processing it. We'd rather follow our desires than what makes logical sense. So let's see. America's a deeply religious country. It's interesting what she says here. 2/3 of the national population and nearly 90% of Congress affirm a tradition in which a teenage girl continuing an unplanned pregnancy allowed for the salvation of the world, in which a corrupt government leader who demanded a massacre of the innocents almost killed the baby Jesus and damned us all in the process, and in which the Son of God entered the world as what the godless dare to call a clump of cells. So this part right here, I'm not sure if she's trying to make fun of Christianity through this description, because you can, through any description, make something look silly. I can offer, under atheism, I could say, look, under atheism, we are just the accidental byproduct of an unintended accidental universe. You and I are the products of nuclear waste and stars, and we are just clumps of cells. Under atheism, we really are just clumps of cells. And of course, that's an uncharitable description, because even under atheism, we can see we are biological organisms. You know, a watch is not a clump of gears unless you smash it with a hammer. Seeing this, like, well, okay, you're trying to uncharitably describe our view. Instead, just address it for what it is, in which a teenage girl continuing an unplanned pregnancy. It's like when people say that Mary was an unwed mother. She was not, by the way. She was betrothed to Joseph, and in Matthew's gospel, the angel Gabriel tells Joseph, "Take Mary, your wife." They were already married under Jewish law. They were just not at the point where they were living together. And so, continuing an unplanned pregnancy, it's not like Mary just woke up and was like, oh my goodness, I'm pregnant. What happened? That was the point of the Annunciation and Mary's fiat, her yes to God, that brought our Savior into the world. Continuing on. So I just don't like when people try to turn, well, look at, Mary had an unplanned pregnancy. Catholics can make a bad argument here, like, well, what if Mary had an abortion? Yeah, that would be bad, obviously. But I just feel like an argument like that's not going to make a ton of traction with someone who's pro-choice, because they think anybody should be able to get an abortion. Focus on what the unborn are. All right. For centuries, most Christians believe that human personhood began months into the long course of pregnancy. That's right. There was a dispute throughout human history about when a human being comes into existence, because for thousands of years, so from the time of Christ until about the 17th century, we were pretty in the dark or mistaken about human development and biology. And that's going to come up here when I talk about different teachings on abortion. It was only in the 20th century that a dogmatic narrative in which every pregnancy is an iteration of the same static story of creation began both to shape American public policy and to occlude the reality of pregnancy as volatile and ambiguous. Well, no, in the 20th century, what becomes a dogmatic narrative, the idea we should protect human life, well, that's not true. If you read the Dobbs versus Jackson opinion, you see in the 19th century states outlawing abortion, doctors taking a stance. This will come up later in the article. And this becomes dogmatic because you have the rise of industries and individuals who are killing the unborn on a scale that had always been known. There had always been abortion and infanticide in human history, but it had risen to a scale and a social acceptability that had not been seen before. So goes on to say some of the things the way this is written. Even within the course of the same pregnancy, a person and the fetus she carries can shift between the roles of lover and beloved, host and parasite, vessel and divinity, victim and murderer. Each body is capable of extinguishing the other, although one cannot survive alone. There is no human relationship more complex, more morally unstable than this. Kernel of truth amidst a pound of lies. It's true. There really is no human relationship like between a mother and her unborn child. The closest we can find may be conjoined twins. Even there, it's not the same thing. So you're right, and we should admit, yes, pregnancy is one of the most unique human relationship on Earth. There's nothing like it. That is true. But it doesn't mean that it's more morally unstable than this. That should give us more stability in seeing the intimacy between a mother and her child. So seeing these host and parasite, that's such an ugly thing to say. Imagine if you said this, the relationship between a mother and her toddler. It goes from mother and child to friend and enemy. In fact, there is a series of books called Your 1-Year-Old, Your 2-Year-Old, Your 3-Year-Old. They're great. My wife and I really enjoy them. And they have little descriptions of what life is like at different ages. So we have a 7-year-old now. The book on the 7-year-old is Your 7-Year-Old Life in a Minor Key. They want to be a grown-up, but they're not nowhere near there yet, but they really want to try. Others, I think, your 1-year-old is fussy and fun-loving. It's your 2 or your 3-year-old is friend or enemy. But imagine if you referred to other human beings as a parasite. First, this is also inaccurate. A parasite is an organism of another species invading a host, sapping their health and nutrients for its good alone. But the unborn belong to the human species. They cannot fall under the definition of a parasite. They're not an invading other species to someone's body. In fact, they are necessary for a person's health. If you're a woman that is unable to gestate a child, then that means you have a health problem. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. Just like if you're a man who cannot impregnate someone, well, you suffer from something that's debilitating, an impediment. You have infertility. And so we devote medical resources and we have compassion on someone. So like for me, I can't fly by flapping my arms. That's not a disability. It's not an impediment because me, by my nature, I can't fly. I can't get pregnant. And so I'm not sad about that because it's not within my nature to get pregnant. But for a biological woman to not be unable to become pregnant, that is sad. It is a part of her nature, even if it's never actualized, if she becomes a consecrated religious, for example. But where was I going with this? Oh, so having a child is the natural fulfillment of bodily health operating properly. So to call the unborn parasites, I would say, throughout human history, like the Nazis called the Jews parasites. Is that really the route that you want to go, considering how in the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, the Tutsis, the Hutus and the Tutsis, I think, the Tutsis were one of them. They're called cockroaches. They would in order to kill other human beings, we have to dehumanize them first. And so you want to continue that relationship. So going through here, for most of history, women ended unwanted pregnancies as they needed to, taking herbal or plant-derived preparations. They were likely enough to think they were restoring their menstruation, treating a blockage of blood. Pregnancy was not confirmed until quickening, the point at which the pregnant person could feel fetal movement. It's so funny, whenever I hear these arguments, like through most of people having abortions throughout most of human history. Well, people have been enslaving others throughout most of human history. People have been exposing infants in the wilderness and killing them through most of human history. People have been killing the elderly members of their community through most of human history. But we don't do that anymore. It's called progress. And so we should make progress when it comes to treating the unborn as well. Yeah, but back then, they didn't know that it was a human being. Okay, they were ignorant. Then that makes them less culpable. But we know now, so shouldn't we follow the science? Shouldn't we be grateful of that? This idea, back then they didn't know. Usually in articles like these, we praise the fact that modern science, when it tells us, hey, this chemical actually makes a hole in the ozone. Oh, aren't we so grateful science showed us the error of our ways and we can change them and not hurt other people? Or science showed us that lead paint is bad for kids to chew, so we take it out of the paint. But only with abortion do somehow people lament that science has proven the unborn or biological human beings. And instead, remember the good old days when we were ignorant and we thought that a baby came into existence 5 months into a pregnancy and it was just like a bag of blood before that point? Why can't we go back to that kind of ignorance? Only with abortion do you have arguments like that. Ancient records of abortifacient medicine are plentiful. That's correct. That's why it talks about the Code of Azara in the 11th century BCE. Right, that's why I want to say the 5th century BCE, 500 BC, BCE. Ugh, I hate that, by the way. CE and BC. Remember, it's BC and 80, before Christ, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. Now it's BCE, before the Common Era, and then CE, Common Era, or Current Era, to which I have to ask, what divides the current era from before the current era? It's just so silly to have that there, but that's a talk for another time. But the Hippocratic Oath says, I will not give a woman a pessary to induce abortion. So even the ancients recognized it being problematic. Here we go. Likewise, the early Christian church opposed abortion not as an act of murder, but because of its association with sexual sin. That's not true. When you read St. Basil the Great, for example, Tertullian, one, they don't wait till quickening. They say, you have killed a man who is to be a man. St. Basil says, with us, there's no nice inquiry between being formed and unformed. So you had some people who said it wasn't murder until quickening. Others who said, no, this is a little man or human that's forming, regardless of whether we can recognize it or not. That it often was connected to sexual sin. That's true. But it's also related to the sin of homicide once one can determine there's a human being here. Now, scientific knowledge had to advance over time to discover that truth, but it was still always true. The Bible offers ambiguous guidance on the question of when life begins. Well, yeah, because the Bible's not a scientific textbook. We don't look to the Bible to tell us whether African Americans are people, or pygmies are people, or people with dwarfism are people. We look at the Bible says all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. So if someone is a human being, then they're made in God's image and they have dignity and ought to be treated as such. Genesis 2:7 arguably implies it begins at first breath. No, it doesn't. It says in Genesis 2:7 that God breathed the breath of life into Adam. He made him from the dirt. Adam was the first human being. He doesn't have a mother according to the Genesis account. So God has to breathe life into him. That wouldn't apply to his descendants. Exodus 21:22-24 suggests in Old Testament law a fetus was not considered a person. No, it does not. It says that if two men struggle and they knock a pregnant woman and she miscarries, that they are guilty and shall be punished. All right? Now, the punishments differ. If they kill the woman, they could be liable to the death penalty. If they kill the unborn child, it says in the text, a child is brought forth. The punishment is less. But there is still a punishment. So how does it, I never get citations of this verse. In Exodus, people are not punished, and they could be punished with the death penalty, we don't know. But it says they are given a lighter punishment for accidentally killing an unborn child. So, but think about it, in Exodus, there is a lighter punishment for accidentally killing a slave. But slaves are recognized as people. You couldn't directly kill them. So just because an accidental, and we do this in today's law, if you accidentally kill someone, the punishment is less than if you directly kill them. And that's what's applying here in Exodus. So it does not show the fetus is not a person. The book of Numbers, for example, doesn't include any child under the age of 1 month after birth in the census. Doesn't mean they weren't persons. It just means you wait until they're definitely going to make it in a time with very high infant mortality. Jeremiah 1:5 describes God's hand in creation even before I formed you in the womb. And yeah, Jeremiah 1:5 is not a great argument for the person of the unborn. Just stick with the science. Nowhere does the Bible clearly and directly address abortion. Correct. The Bible does say it's wrong to kill human beings. Science says the unborn are human, ipso facto. That's probably not the correct usage there. Therefore, abortion is wrong. Augustine in the 4th century favored the idea God endowed a fetus with a soul only after its body was formed, in line with the Aristotelian tradition, and that's the same with goes down here. This was more or less the church's official position, but the church doesn't have an official position. Even in 1974, in the CDF's Declaration on Procured Abortion, it says in a footnote the church does not take a position on ensoulment because God has not revealed the exact moment when ensoulment occurs. If you say the moment of fertilization, by the way, that's not a moment. That's a process that takes 24 hours. So God hasn't told us exactly when a organism gets a soul. But a lot of theologians say what makes sense is, well, the soul is what animates the body. So once the human body comes into existence, you have a rational soul. And science now tells us there's a human body that exists, an individual organism at successful fertilization. At least once fertilization is successfully completed. So in the early modern era, European attitudes began to change. The Black Death dramatically lowered the continent's population and dealt a blow to most forms of economic activity. The Reformation weakened the church's position. So this is basically Silvia Federici's argument that they were trying to prop up birth rates to support capitalism, and that's why abortion is wrong, that doesn't really make sense, because you can find condemnations of abortion that are severe both before and after this point. What really changes the condemnation of abortion is the development of understanding of human biology. So we see this. This one comes up a lot. Catholics for Choice loves to bring this one up. Let me go down to this here. So there we go. Catholic doctrine started to shift after the Reformation, they say. In 1588, Pope Sixtus V labeled both abortion and contraception as homicide. This pronouncement was reversed 3 years later by Pope Gregory XIV, who declared that abortion was only homicide if it took place after ensoulment, which he identified as occurring around 24 weeks into a pregnancy. Now, this, when you read this, it gives you an impression of something that didn't actually take place. The primary reason for the reversal was that Gregory XIV believed that Sixtus's the punishment he gave was too severe, like requiring excommunication for abortion at any stage that could only be lifted by the Holy See. So Gregory wanted to allow other bishops to be able to do that against what Sixtus had allowed, and he can do that. You can make disciplinary reforms. Also, people assume, like if a regular person just read this, they would take it to mean abortion was a sin in 1588, and it was not a sin before 24 weeks into pregnancy under Gregory XIV. False. It was still a grave sin. It wasn't considered homicide because there's still debate about whether the unborn child had a soul, whether it had a rational body, but it was still a grave sin. Contraception and abortion were both considered, and still are, grave sins because they're an attack on human life. Contraception is an attack on a life that's going to come to be. It is a way of saying, I don't want you here. I reject you before you even come into existence. Contraception is an attack on life before it comes into existence. Abortion is an attack on life in its earlier existence. Still, it was not until 1869 that Pope Pius IX affirmed this doctrine. I guess going back here, the soul was present from the moment of conception. He's not affirming that doctrine, proclaiming abortion at any point in pregnancy to be a sin punishable by excommunication. That's the other issue. It was a grave sin before 24 weeks of pregnancy. You just weren't excommunicated. So some people, when they read church documents, they'll see, this pope didn't excommunicate people for abortion. Well, in canon law today, there are a ton of grave sins you're not automatically excommunicated for. Murder, rape, adultery. It's only under certain circumstances. If you murder the Pope, you're excommunicated. Attacking attacks on the Pope. But grave sins don't always incur excommunication. They'll still damn you to hell if you commit them. They're still bad for you. Excommunication is a medicinal punishment for people to see the specific gravity of certain sins. So the reason that canon law actually in 1983, in the revision of the Code of Canon Law, still maintained excommunication for abortion, but not, why do we excommunicate related to abortion, but not murder? One reason is that the church wanted to be a witness that even if civil governments will not stand up for the unborn, the church will through its law, through whatever means that it can. But still, through all of this, we have to remember this principle. Just because the church changes punishments for sins, it doesn't follow it changed its teaching that something is or is not a sin. That's important to remember, because in church history, you'll see penances and punishments for sins changing. Penances in the early church were really brutal. They could last for years at a time, or decades even. And those were lightened because some people will think, I'm not going to confess this sin if I have to have a 5-year penance. So the penances that were meant to inspire people to holiness became a barrier to forgiveness. And so those developed, and those have changed over time. But the sins are still sins. Abortion was a sin in the first century at any stage, just as it is a sin today at any stage. Its codification in canon law developed as canon law itself developed, but the teaching itself, it never changed. All right, finally, I'm just going to scroll down a little bit here to the part that I think is really sad. Abortion is often talked about as a grave act that requires justification, but bringing a new life into the world felt to me like the decision that more clearly risked being a moral mistake. I gave birth in the middle of a pandemic that previewed a future of cross-species viral transmission exacerbated by global warming, and during a summer when 10 million acres on the West Coast burned. You also gave birth. Our third child was born in the midst of the pandemic. But and really what made that hard were nonsensical pandemic policies that risked me not even being present at the birth itself. Thankfully I was, because we accidentally gave birth at home. So it's all good. But just seeing this here, you also live in a time where a vaccine that was created for this was developed in months. It was an amazing technological achievement. Let's see here. Oh, and the West Coast, 10 million acres burning on the West Coast. That's not a modern global warming thing. When you read the diaries of people settlers like on the Oregon Trail, who were moving out to California, they would talk about how the sky was orange and filled with smoke because there were raging wildfires during the 19th century in California. That's a part of the natural ecosystem. And really, it's a lot of our forest policies that contribute to wildfires, not so much climate. Watch, see if this episode gets dinged for climate misinformation. Talks about an essay in the London Review of Books, Is It Okay to Have a Child? The title alludes to a question that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez once asked in a live stream. It's like, well, we should have abortion because look at how the world is going to end because of climate change. I can't stand these kinds of arguments. When you actually read climate change reports, I'm not going to get into all of climate change, but the worst case scenarios talk about the number of deaths increasing, but they don't talk about the global extinction or even human extinction. They talk about things like slow GDP and maybe an increase of deaths in the hundreds of thousands or millions. But there are also 46. There are tens of millions of people that die every year. There's 46 million abortions that occur worldwide every year. Obviously, if there's something we can do to prevent loss of life from climate issues, we should do that. Honestly, one of the big things we have done in human history to prevent climate killing, to prevent the climate from killing us, are fossil fuels. More people die from cold-related deaths than heat-related deaths. More people die from blizzards than heat waves. And fossil fuels have given us an ability to protect people from extreme cold weather events. And less cold weather events end up being better for people. Trent Horn is a crazy climate change guy. I'm Kermit the climate change frog. I don't like what Trent Horn is saying. I'm going to cover this in a future book on Catholics and social issues. It'll be fun. In late 2021, as Omicron brought New York to another peak, a Gen Z boy in a hoodie uploaded a TikTok captioned, "Y'all better delete them baby names out your notes. It's 60 degrees in December." This idea that people are being told, and this is why, here's the problem. This is crying wolf. The people are being told the world's going to end, so don't bother having a child, get an abortion, that this is an attack on human life through alarmists. And there have always been alarmists. There were people in the 1970s who thought there was going to be a new ice age. There's always been people who have said that in the early 20th century, eugenicists said we'd be overrun with the poor and the mentally handicapped if we didn't sterilize people. Don't give in to the alarmists. And so it's sad to see somebody talking about this. There's unknowability in every reproductive choice. Like, well, this is so sad. By then, I guess she had the baby. My baby had become a toddler. Every night as I set her in the crib, she chirped good night to the elephants, koalas, and tigers on the wall. And I tried not to think about extinction. Oh my goodness, just play with your kid. Even if the world is going to go extinct, eventually it will. Love your child. You need to have an eternal perspective. If this life is your only life, this life becomes an idol for you. I mean, we see that. We see some people, if you don't have a proper understanding of life, mortality, and destiny, this life will become an idol. Or you'll be you're either a nihilist who doesn't give a rip about anything, or you become you idolize life. That even if it saves one life. I mean, Governor Cuomo, before his scandal and everything, we're going to do everything we can. Even if it saves just one life, it's worth it. Even if you cause absolute human misery, it's worth it to save one life. Now, I agree we should not directly kill one person to achieve certain goods. That's do not do evil so good may come. But we also have to balance competing goods. I mean, you could take away all of our freedom to give us safety. Reduce the speed limit to 25 miles an hour. Make everybody wear a helmet when they go outside. That will save lives. But it's not the kind of lives we really want to have, is it? So I'm trying to see, is there anything else in here? Yeah, so I mean, it talks about like how the fetus developing, and I don't know. Is there more that I can just? Yeah, there's a little bit more. Talking by the time that the Catholic Church decided that abortion at any point for any reason was a sin, bam, that's where you're wrong. It had always taught that. The question is, how severe is it? Is it homicide? Is it some kind of contraception? Is it somewhere in between? Should it be excommunicable offense? Is it not? The gravity of the punishments have changed, but it was always considered a sin, even from the first century. So there's that distinction between just because punishments change does not mean the teaching changes. And it's important because, look, remember, we go to science to say, all right, well, what does science tell us? And especially you look at Pope Sixtus and Pope Gregory, what really changed our understanding of unborn children was Anton van Leeuwenhoek, I think was his name, in 1670 to 1680, end of the 17th century. You had the discovery of human sperm, and then later the human ovum. Now, we can see that Aristotle thought that the man's semen entered the woman, and I think it's supposed to be a kind of blood, and if it takes or doesn't take from the blood, you get a vegetable life, then an animal life, then a human life. We saw, no, when sperm and egg come together, we have a complete human body at this moment that just grows and develops like you and I. So shouldn't we follow the science then and just respect and affirm that life? At the time, abortion was largely unregulated in the United States, a country founded by Protestants, but American physicians from the American Medical Association mounted a campaign to criminalize it, led by Horatio Storer. He called the typical abortion patient a wretch whose account with the Almighty is heaviest with guilt. Storer, raised Unitarian, later converted to Catholicism. They also don't mention here that the American Medical Association called abortionists modern-day Herods. That for them, it's because this kills a human being, we should protect human beings. Oh, how they have fallen from that point. And then she just goes on to complain about the laws and how they're put forward. Ultrasound imaging in the late 1950s. This is interesting. Ultrasound imaging, invented in the 1950s, completed the transformation of pregnancy into a story that by default was narrated to women by other people, doctors, politicians, activists. So only with abortion, right? Isn't it great when science... I mean, you don't see these people saying astronomy and biology changed a story about the earth that was revealed to us by God, and instead it's scientists that tell us things. Well, they will say that, but what they mean is we're glad we don't have the story God tells us, and we have the scientific evidence. That they take the point that God's story is wrong, the scientists are right, and we should just go with the science on this when it's something like that. Even though the Bible does not tell us, Cardinal Caesar Baronius put it well, the Bible does not tell us how the Bible tells us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. So the Bible is not a scientific textbook. It tells us who made the world, why they did it, and where human beings fit into the big picture. But how it developed over time, science tells us that, and that's a good thing. But with pregnancy, it's like they want to turn pregnant women into mystical shamans, that she can tell us with her feminine wisdom, is this a life or not? Only she can know. No. Pregnant women do tell us their unique experiences they undergo that non-pregnant individuals, I'm not saying pregnant people, there are pregnant women and non-pregnant people, right? Because there are women who don't get pregnant and men who don't get pregnant. There aren't pregnant people. Actually, I think that is in here. I think, is it? Let's see. Oh, good. Yeah, I think I missed this. Pregnancy was not confirmed. I missed this. All right. Pregnancy was not confirmed until quickening, the point at which the pregnant person could feel fetal movement. The pregnant person. And yet what's interesting here is through the rest of the article, they say women give birth. Women, as it happens to many women, though. It's so funny. At that one point, maybe she didn't mean the transgender thing, because she, if she just wrote pregnant people over and over and over again, it would be quite obvious how silly it is. So she just have to have pregnant person in there just once. All right. Did I I cover everything else in here? I think I've. Oh, here's an interesting point. I'm gonna end with this, and then we'll be good. Talks about how in 1965, Life magazine published a photo essay by Leonard Nielsen called "Drama of Life Before Birth," and it put the image of a fetus at 18 weeks on its cover. The photos produced an indelible, deceptive image of the fetus as an isolated being, a spaceman, as Nielsen wrote, floating in a void, independent from the person whose body creates it. They became totems of the anti-abortion movement. Life had not disclosed that all but one had been taken of aborted fetuses. But you should remember that if you look at and they're beautiful images. Life Before Birth from Leonard Nielsen. Nielsen is pro-choice. He doesn't, I wrote to his foundation once if I could use the pictures for a project. They said no. They don't grant permission for them to be used for pro-lifers. But the truth is there, even if the person showing it is completely opposed to it. So that's an interesting thing. Life Before Birth, the drama of Life Before Birth, Leonard Nielsen, still some of the greatest photos of unborn children. Let's see if I can bring that up, actually. Will that come up here? Yeah, there it is. So, yeah, there you go. Wow, that is... and that was in 1965, before, we really took off on in utero photographs and ultrasounds. So I'm so grateful for the victories that we have managed to secure recently for these children. So let's continue at them, shall we? Thank you guys so much. I hope that this was all helpful for you all. And yeah, I hope you have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.